Hello, art historians. Today we're going to do another lesson in sculpture and art from the classical period of Greece. And so today we're going to talk about this statue and its artist, which both are like super important to art history, to sculpture as a whole, to the way we craft examples of the human body, all of those things. This is really one of those artistic pieces that I cannot express to you how important this is. The likelihood of this image or something that is influenced by it showing up on the AP exam is very high. It's just really critically important. So let's talk about what we're looking at. So the name of this piece is Doryphoros. That's its Greek name. It's also called the spear bearer because you can see in his hand there would have been a spear at one point. So this piece, Doryphoros, is super important. The original piece would have been made in bronze, sometime between 450 and 440. This is the problem that happens with a lot of Greek pieces, is that they're originally crafted in bronze, but then when Rome took over what was Greece and folded it into well, it still is Greece, but when Rome took over what was Hellenistic or classical Greece and folded it into the Roman Empire, they went into those places and they took the bronze statues and they melted them down, but only after they had made marble copies of them. So what you see here is a marble copy that was probably made somewhere between 120 and 50 BCE of the original bronze 450 to 440 BCE. And so it's important that we realize that a lot of classical pieces that we see that are in marble were originally in bronze, and we're looking at reproductions of them. The Romans liked the pieces, but they wanted the bronze to do things like make weapons and shields and things like that. So they melted them down and put them into a sturdy marble version, which is really unsettling and makes a lot of archaeologists very unhappy. So this marble copy was actually found in a gym, like where you go to get buff, that kind of gym, in Pompeii. It's really a big deal. What you see are some things that would not have been in the bronze original, however. This piece here that attaches the hand to the hip, that would not have been part of the bronze original. It's for stability to keep that arm from breaking off. This tree trunk back here would also not have been in the bronze original. This is there in a lot of marble pieces to, again, for stability, to keep them from breaking. And this piece here that anchors, you can barely see it, it's like a little square piece here that helps the foot to anchor. That is also an addition in the marble, and it's simply to keep it more stable, to reduce the possibility of breakage. So let's talk first about what we see. This is what the Greeks would have believed was the ideal body. He was a sportsman. He was in good condition. He has wide, broad shoulders. He has a very thick, muscular torso. He's not actually looking at you. He is averting his eyes so that you can look at him, but he's not going to make you uncomfortable by you looking at him. Most athletics, most sculptures of athletes were done in the nude. And we talked about this before, the frequency of nude images, because they were celebrating the human form. And we're talking about the concept of there being perfection in the human form. We talked a little bit about that when we did the golden ratio or the golden mean. He's a little larger than life size. He's 6'6", so a little bit larger than life size. And what he has are what are considered the canon of proportions. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and Polykleitos. Polykleitos was an artist, but also a writer. And Polykleitos wrote a treatise, a way to explain things to people called the Canon of Proportions. And it is a way to make sure that everyone was using the exploring the complex mechanics of the human body and its movement. And it's very, the human body is complex. We're not looking at stiff figures like we were during the archaic period. We're looking at a perfectly harmonious balance of proportions of the human body in sculpted form. And it is focused on math, and it is focused on the mathematical proportions of the human body. Things like the ratio of the head to the body is 1:7, and things like, the body has to be asymmetrical but balanced. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. The ancient Greeks thought that the human form was perfect. Not individually, not each individual human form was perfect, but as a whole, humanity was perfect. A good way to explain that is horses. Horses are not perfect. Horses can't throw up. Horses, their abdomen will twist. They'll get the bloat. They die frequently. If a horse breaks its leg, you have to put it down, not because the leg can't heal, but during the process of healing, they get the bloat and they get really sick, and you have to horses are like, everything about a horse is just wrong. Its legs, its stomach, like bees. Everything about a bee is wrong. Based on the size of its wings and the size of its body, it shouldn't be able to fly, but it does, right? The Greeks focused on the idealistic form that is the human body. And they believed that the human body was perfect. In 571, Pythagoras, our favorite mathematician, the Pythagorean theorem, he said that there had to be like math in music and in calculations, geometry, ratios, and what Polykleitos does is he applies that Pythagorean math to art. And now we see what Polykleitos wrote in the Canon of Proportions, how the body needs to be harmonious and balanced. And so when we think about that, we really need to think about how we depict that. What is it we do in art when we're depicting the human form that makes the human form look perfect? And one of the things that we don't really think about is the difference between how Doryphoros is standing versus how we would have seen Menkaure and his spouse, or the Koros, or the Kore. What is it here that's different? And it's a very, very, very important term that applies to literally every depiction of the human form pretty much after that. And so what we're looking at here, I'm going to switch to the next thing here. What we're looking at is, it was originally titled Canon because it established Polykleitos's Canon of Proportions, which set up the concept of the ideal way to depict the human body. And here's this vocabulary word that you absolutely positively must understand: contrapposto. Okay. And there's this thing here that says, notice the harmony of opposites. I'm going to show you in a second what that means. But if you look at it, let's scroll and look. Okay. This is what contrapposto is. On your left is the Koros. Look at how straight all those lines are. On your right is what it looks like when your body is in what is called a contrapposto stance. It's the shifting of your weight. Look at the left shoulder, his left, not ours. His left shoulder is higher because his right shoulder is lower, because his, he has the piece on, I'm sorry, his right shoulder is lower, his left shoulder is higher. He's got that piece up there, the spear on his shoulder. And because the one shoulder is higher, he bends the knee to help distribute that weight. And the spine actually curves. And the other hip, where the knee is bent, the other hip goes up. So let's look at this next slide. This is what contrapposto looks like. This is when you look at how to draw figures, and if you've ever wondered why you draw a figure and it just doesn't look right, it's probably this balance. The weight shifts here to their left side. The left shoulder is lower than the right side. The left side is a little bit flexed. The left hip is a little bit higher than the right hip. It's almost like, look at how that comes together. That left shoulder dips, the left hip comes up. And it's this idea that you transfer your body from one foot to the other. And that's really important. None of us stand with our knees locked like that, like the Choros is. We stand with our knees slightly bent, usually one more bent than the other, with our hips slightly rotated. Like this is what a comfortable body posture looks like. This is contrapposto. And in the Doryphoros, well, let's go back to the Doryphoros. In the Doryphoros, what we see is the right leg is the one that's weight bearing, that one that's closer to us. Okay, the right leg is load bearing. The left leg is more relaxed. The left hand, however, is weight bearing, and that's why it's opposite that right leg. They balance each other. The right hand is relaxed, and so this is bearing the weight, and this is bearing the weight, and this settles the weight across the body. This is balanced here. It's very difficult to hold the weight of your body on one leg and then have also that arm carry weight. And that's why that weight is distributed. This is really mathematically important. It's artistically important. It's drawing important. I have a little silly video to show you, not a video, a comic to show you. Look at all of our Egyptians standing with their perfectly perfect legs, one in front of the other, no one's bent. Wow, is that Heptop? He looks amazing. How is Greece, Heptop? You look really relaxed. Yeah, I got into contrapposto over there. It's where you put all your weight on one leg. I feel really dynamic. Dynamic meaning moving, not static. I love how his hips and shoulders aren't parallel. He just looks so alive and graceful. And then this guy is thinking, it's a bunch of bull crap. Look at what we're looking at. Okay, and this is, look at how un-Egyptian he looks. At the end of this video, I'm going to show you a video from the Khan Academy on contrapposto that might do a better job of explaining it if my explanation wasn't clear enough. So you can hang around for a contrapposto video from the Khan Academy at the end. But what we're going to switch to now is probably the most famous piece of Greek architecture and art ever. And if you've ever wondered how we get to 475 images when we only have 250 artifacts, it's because something like the Acropolis, you have 6 images that you have to know for the exam. It's a lot. The first one you have to know is this site plan, okay? And so I'm going to let you sort of sketch out, I'm so sorry. I'm going to let you sort of sketch out that site plan for a second there. And take a look at it and hope that you recognize that this road that would have continued this way is the road that leads down to the Agora via the Parthenon way. Okay, this is the Parthenon way again, right? Here it is right there. And if you were to come down here and follow this down the hill, you would end up in the Agora. If you come up the hill and then you come up these steps, you end up in the Acropolis, okay? And so what you're looking at is this amazing complex of construction, okay? And you see several pieces that may or may not seem familiar to you. And they may not necessarily seem familiar to you until you actually see them, as opposed to just seeing the floor plan or the site plan. Sorry, this is a site plan, not a floor plan. But let's look at it. This is from Athens, okay? And this is, this is really, really critically important because this is sort of a fortified hill. It's up on a hill. We talked about that when we did the Agora. I'm so sorry, you guys. It's up on a hill. I just bumped the mouse and it was having a little minute. It's up on a hill. It's a religious site. Almost everything that's up there is made from marble. And what ends up happening is this whole construction is based on what happened in the war with Pericles and the Persians and all of that stuff. So we have to talk about a little tiny bit of history because it becomes really important with the building of the Acropolis here. So we have to study our history just a skosh. So you need to know who Pericles is, Pericles. We talked about the fact that, there was a huge turnover in a lot of Greek military and democracy, but that when we're dealing with that, Pericles lasted for a really long time in control of Athens. And that is because he was involved in the Peloponnesian War. He was involved in the beating, in the defeat of the Persians. He was really, really critically important in the foundation of Athens as the major player, if not the most important player in all of the Greek city-states. So when we're looking at this piece, we see that we also get this this idea of the construction by Ictinos and Callicrates. And Ictinos and Callicrates were your architects and designed the buildings and the sculptural campaign or the sculptural program. Depends on who you are, what you call it. So it's really important that we start with this area is up on a big hill. And it was the place for temples for a long time. And when the Persians came in and got into a big fight with the Greeks, they came in and they destroyed the temples that were there. And so what we see here are temples that were then created during Pericles. He wins the war and he begins the golden age of Athens, which is roughly from 460 to 430. And so once the golden age of Athens begins, Pericles uses a bunch of money that they were able to get together through the war, and he creates, or he doesn't create, he hires people to create a huge complex on the top of the hill to, one, sort of make clear their win, two, to thank Athena for their win, three, as a way for Athens to have a place to store important things like money. There were lots of statues here that were gilded in gold. There were lots of things that were made out of interesting materials that then allowed for Athens to be like, okay, well, I can put this right here, and if I need it, I can, get it by melting down some gold and stuff. So the Acropolis is a really important idea as far as sort of looking at what Pericles did and the campaign that he waged against pretty much all of the enemies of Athens. And then this idea that he hires Ictinus and Callicrates as the primary architects. So most city-states had an Acropolis. That just simply means fortified hill. This one is the most famous Acropolis because it's in Athens. It is a temple to Athena. It's up high because the higher you are, the closer you are to the gods. It's a whole. Athens is dedicated to Athena, and maybe you know the story, maybe you don't, because there was a war between Poseidon and Athena over who should be the patron god or goddess of Athens. And Poseidon offered them like a spring, and Athena offered them an olive tree, which you could use the wood and you could use the olives and you could make olive oil and you could eat the olives, and there was all this stuff. So clearly they picked Athena. So let's look at some of the buildings. So this is your first image, your site plan. Okay, we'll go to the second image. Okay, the second image we're going to look at is probably on the Acropolis, the most famous piece on the Acropolis. A lot of people, when they think Acropolis, think this building, and that's okay if you did. A lot of people don't know that the Acropolis is the whole hill, and that the Parthenon is just this one building. At the end of this video, I'm also going to show you a really cool Khan Academy on the Parthenon. So there'll be 2 Khan Academy videos at the end of mine. What you see here is we had Ictinos and Callicrates, who were our architects. We have Phidias, who's our sculptor. Sculptor of what? There was a huge sculptural campaign here on this foundation. There are a bunch of statues all over the whole area. Let me show you what the Parthenon would have looked like. Whoa. Okay, there would have been a giant statue of Athena inside, completely covered in gold. The idea is that her arms and her face were made of ivory, in an interesting and brand new construction way to roll out ivory and make it flat so that they could then mold it into her arms and her face. So Phidias was like a genius. So this would have been inside. You'll see there's columns and then a second tier and then a second row of columns, and then the roof. And there would have been a flat wood roof inside, but then the the marble roof on the top. It would have been wildly painted. We talked about this sculptural program, the frieze, which is a whole line of sculptures. We talked about how there would have been these intricate designs. It would have been wildly painted. And there's an interesting thing, which is, I'm going to scroll again, that there are 2 sets of sculptures. Here we have those triglyphs, those 3 little bloop, bloop, bloop that we talked about when we did the Greek orders. And this is where a metope would have been, like a single statue that sort of sits on its, a single like little relief that sits on its own. And then another triglyph and the metope and a triglyph and a metope. So it would have been this little thing here and then a sculpture that tells a story, and then this 1, 2, 3 here and a sculpture that tells a story. Then on the inside row of columns, there was what's called an actual frieze, where the whole thing is one uninterrupted picture that tells a story. So there's actually 2 what we call artistic programs here, one on the inside of the colonnade and one on the outside of the colonnade. So we see a lot of really cool things with the Parthenon, and I'll cover some of it, and there will also be others that we'll talk about. I'm going to scroll back so that we look at this one. Whoops, sorry. And then we're going to talk about why it looks the way that it looks and stuff like that. So it's a Doric temple. As you can see, it has those dull little columns that, dull Doric, that come up to the top. It represents really the power of Greek civilization. Phidias, like I said, would have been the sculptor that was in charge of all of those metopes and the metopes and the friezes. And so, you're looking at a really cool building. It has massive columns that are fluted, so it has those lines that go up and down the columns. But they're simple, and the columns come all the way down to the floor because they're those Doric columns. So they come all the way down and touch the stylobate, the floor. Now, it would have been brightly painted. We talked about that. It would have been full of valuables, not just the gold statue of Athena, but also other statues and things like that that would have been inside to honor Athena. It is, without a doubt, probably the most influential building of all time. And many modern buildings are still built to look like this. Museums downtown, the National Gallery of Art, one of the sides of the archives, it influenced the Capitol building. There's a lot of things that this was really influential about. And there's a lot of math, because the Greeks love math, in order to construct this. So I'm going to go forward one more. Look at how tall it is. It's 45 feet tall. Okay. The length from this corner to that corner is 228 feet. So like a 22-story building. The length from this corner to this corner across the front is 101 feet. So like a 10-story building. We're looking at a giant, giant building. That's a person. That's a person. That's a person. So it's hard to sort of get the idea of how complex and how giant it is. But then we think about it and we realize that it's not exactly perfect. There's actually almost zero perfectly perfect right angles in here, because the Greeks played around with the math and how things look to make them look symmetrical no matter where you were looking at them from. So we see with Greek temples, because of the Greek orders, the steps go all the way around. Okay, we see that the sculptural campaign is here inside this pediment. There might have been some sculptures on the outside, but not like the Etruscans, not as many. Okay, the statues, not the statues, the columns, the shaft of the column, the middle part, is actually, it's so crazy. They're actually wider in the center, because when you look at something from far away, the center seems to shrink in. And by making them wider in the center, when you look at them from far away, they will look like they're the same height all the way from top to bottom, even though they actually are a little wider in the center. The ones on the end are actually thicker than the ones in the center, because when you look at something like this from far away, the way your eye perceives it, the ones on the ends tend to look smaller because they're floating out there in space. And so they made the ones on the end a little bit fatter so that they would look the same from far away. The ground, the floor of the temple is not straight. It's actually curved up a little bit in the middle to correct for the fact that when you look at something from a distance, oftentimes the middle sort of seems to get a little bit wonky, but also for drainage. There's a lot of really cool stuff that goes on here. There are over 192 figures that are carved to commemorate the Battle of Marathon, to commemorate the Battle of Pericles against all of his enemies, and over the Persians, and over all of the guys that were just giving him a hard time, because they believed that the gods delivered them from this, these terrible things that happened to them. So let's go to your next one, your next image here. And remember, we have this frieze in here that tells a story. This is a piece of that frieze. Okay, so our next piece is what is called the Plaque of the Ergostines. I really, actually, genuinely adore this piece. I think it's really awesome. So again, it's from this same campaign, sculptural campaign or sculptural program. It is called the Plaque of the Ergostines. And who are the Ergostines? Well, the Ergostines were the rich young women of Athens, and their job was to create things that would honor Athena. So this piece, this little chunk right here, it's 3 feet tall, about 7 feet long, and what you see are these women in their little dresses, their peploses, in honor of Athena. And this piece actually is at the Louvre, and we're going to talk about that in a second here. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. When we get to the end of this piece, we're going to talk about sort of the sculptural campaign in its whole. So this is that frieze inside the porch of the Parthenon. The Ergostines were young, rich women of Athens who wove garments for Athena. And what they did is they would make garments for the statue of Athena, this big giant statue, this giant one. They would make her garments, or for small statues of her too. And they would make garments for the statues. And then during the procession from the Agora up the Panathenaic Way to the Parthenon that would happen every 4 years, every citizen would process up, go up through the Agora, go to the Parthenon, go around the whole Parthenon, and then process back as a way of honoring Athena. But when they got up to the front of the Parthenon, the Ergostines, these women, would offer the garments that they made to the priests, who would then, pass them, give them to the statue of Athena. What's interesting about this piece is that a lot of the other friezes all of the metopes, so those little ones on the outside, the metopes on the outside really told a story of sort of gods and things like that. The ones on the inside were much more human in the telling of their story. They told a lot about like the humans and the people of Athens and things like that. So it's really one of the first times that we see not a mythical story, but a human on a temple. So it's kind of a big deal. The Parthenon is great because it combines those mythological god stories on the outside of the Parthenon's, sides, but stories of humans on the inside set of columns in those friezes. There's lots of rhythm, lots of movement. It's not, it has anatomical correctness. We see the contrapposto, we see the 1 foot and forward, but not perfectly straight. We see the women coming in. He is famous, Phidias, the sculptor, was famous for carving into stone fabric that looked like you could see the actual folds of the fabric. And so this was a really cool way of honoring the people of Athens, as opposed to always just honoring the gods. Now, these are the people that are honoring the gods, but that's what you see here. So the plaque of the Ergostines, the presentation of gifts to the gods. The women make it, they give them to the priests, then the priests present them to the gods. Okay. Our next piece here is a piece from the pediment, and I'm going to scroll to the next one. So this is what you see. Okay, this is that center area. Don't worry about that. We're looking at this piece over here. Okay, we see Helios in his chariot, Dionysus, the guy that, the god of the wine, Demeter, and Artemis. Okay. And this is cool because what you end up with when you build a building with a pediment like this is the Philadelphia Museum of Art. When you build a building with a pediment like this, you are required then to construct what? A triangular shaped sculpture. You can't just make all of the figures the same height. You are brought into the difficulty of making a sculpture that fits into a triangle. And the shape of the pediment dictates what the sculpture would have looked like. Here's a really excellent example of a triglyph and a metope. So there would have been, this is the battle between the humans and the centaurs. So there's this little, the lapiths and the centaurs. So you would have had the triglyph here and a metope, and a triglyph and a metope, and a triglyph and a metope. So these are like blocks of a comic book, right? This is a whole story. And the frieze is a whole story. So this is a really good way of looking at what the Parthenon would have looked like. So let's go back to your piece here. So this is your actual image. And what you're seeing is here's the horse coming up with Helios riding the horse. Remember, Helios brings the sun. And so the chariot carries Helios, who brings the sun. And the sun in this piece is representative of birth, because what we're looking at here is the frieze that the sculptural campaign that depicts the birth of Venus from the head of Zeus with all the other deities watching. And this is on the east pediment of the Parthenon. And so we see Helios and the horse coming. We see Dionysus with his drink. We see Demeter here, probably with her daughter Persephone. And then this is actually the body of Athena, and we're going to start to see like how that works. But look at how the sculptural campaign fits comfortably into the triangular shape, because the bodies help to just tell the story, and Phidias figures out how to fit this story that he needs to show into a triangular piece. The College Board is only holding you responsible for this one piece of that pediment sculpture, but we'll talk a little bit more when you watch the video. You'll talk a little bit more. It will talk a little bit more about the entire sculptural campaign, which wouldn't hurt to know. So there's a question about whether this is actually Hercules. The majority of art historians believe that this is Dionysus. So when we look at this piece and we look at the building that looks like this, and we see that there are some of the frieze left, but all of the metopes are gone. This is a reconstruction of the frieze. It's not real, so don't get excited. Why are all of these pieces missing? Where did they all go? What happened? So this is a really terrible moment in archaeological art historian history. And this is the moment where we start talking about who should own what and where things belong. There was a man, and his name was Lord Elgin. And he was a fan of studying Greek history, and he kind of was like an early archaeologist, but not really. He was just sort of he stole stuff. And Elgin went over to Greece when it was still in the hands of the Ottoman Empire, and he made a really shady deal with an Ottoman sheikh who told him that he could take some of the metopes and some of the friezes in order to protect them. He ended up stealing all of them, and he took them all to Greece. No, not to Greece, to London. And almost all of the entire sculptural campaign from the Parthenon is in the British Museum. The Greeks built the Athenian Museum, the Acropolis Museum in Athens. It's a beautiful museum. It's a wonderful, wonderful space. And all of the statues from the frieze and the metope that are there are all replicas, because the majority of them are held in London at the British Museum, and the rest are held in Paris at the Louvre. And the Greeks have been asking for these things back. They're called the Elgin marbles sometimes. Archaeologists and art historians are working very hard to get people to call them the Parthenon marbles. But it really is a conversation about, to whom does art belong? Does it belong to the British because they bought them, air quotes, bought them under a contract, and then took them back to England and have, for over 150 years taken care of them? Should they continue to be in the British Museum in London, or do they belong in Greece, in Athens, in the museum there that is, a part of looking at the history of the Acropolis? I'll let you make your own decisions about what you want to think about that, but that's one of the questions. To whom does art belong, and how do we decide to whom it belongs? And when does the original place that had the art get to keep the art, and when does the art stay with the person who excavated it? So these are questions we'll talk about all year. So this is just one of the first times we'll talk about it. Okay, we're going to move on to our next piece, which is the Temple of Athena Nike. Okay, so don't look at this one yet. We're doing this temple real quick. So this temple, again, designed by our architects, Ictinos and Callicrates. It's 18 feet high. It's 27 feet wide across the side, 18 and a half feet across the front. It's almost square. And it's called an amphipro style, which means it has 4 columns in the front and 4 columns in the back. So like you could enter from the front or the back, and you can go in either way. And this is on that sacred path, the Panathenaic Way. And it's on that path. I'm going to make you a little car sick for a minute. Sorry, just give me a second. When you look here, it's right here. As you come up the stairs from the Agora, up these stairs, it's sitting right there at the gate to enter the Acropolis. And so it's sort of like at the holy place where, it's right in front of the most important entrance, which is called the Propylaea. This is right before the Propylaea. The Propylaea is called the gatehouse. That's how you really know you're on the Acropolis. So this piece was built to honor the victory over the Persians in the Battle of Marathon. Nike means victory. And so Athena is often called just Athena, or sometimes she's called Pallas Athena, which means like goddess Athena. And sometimes she's called Athena Nike. And you would call her Athena Nike when you're trying to talk about Athena being the goddess of victory. So were lots of, you can see them, there are lots of images up here at the top, and they would have been images depicting the Battle of Marathon and the Greeks being, successful in winning there. The interior statue of Athena doesn't exist. There was a statue of Athena in there. It would have been marble. It doesn't exist any longer. And it had sort of like, you're up here on the hill, and it had sort of like a wall, like a railing kind of wall, that would have kept you from falling basically off the hill. And that wall was then covered in friezes. And that word, I think I keep saying it, but I'm not sure I've ever spelled it, F-R-I-E-Z-E. And that's a frieze, not freeze like it's cold, but frieze like a bunch of pictures, F-R-I-E-Z-E. R-I-E-Z-E, yeah. So the wall that would have kept you from falling off the Acropolis and down up, several hundred feet to the town would have been covered with pictures. And this is not pictures, statues. And this is one of those statues. This is Athena Nike, or Victory adjusting her sandal. And this is considered, on all of the Acropolis, one of the most beautiful pieces of statue. And the reason for that, there are a few. One, this is what we call high relief. Before, I've talked to you about bas relief, like low relief, where it doesn't stick up too far from the back. This is bas relief. This is bas relief. Doesn't stick up too much from the marble in the back. This is high relief. It's attached to the wall in the back, like the plaque of the Ergostines, but it comes really far off the wall. Okay. She's 42 inches high. She's on that railing. She's visually really cool. And the reason she's visually really cool is she would not have looked like she was balanced. She has 1 foot here on the ground. She has 1 foot here where she's taking off her shoe. What you see here broken off would have been her wings and her arm, and here would have been her face. So her wing, if she could not have balanced like this, look, the leg is bent. This leg is bent. If she tried to do this, she would fall. But because she's a goddess and she has wings, there's her wing, okay? And you can even see the back part of it, but it would have been attached here. And her wing keeps her upright. Now, this is very sensual. It appeals to your senses. You can almost see that wing. You can almost hear the wind. Look at, this is an important sculptural term. This is what is called wet drapery. It looks like the cloth is almost wet so that you can see the definition of the folds. Notice that it comes off her shoulder there. You can see the outline or the impression of her breast, but it's not overly sexualized, but it's definitely there. Look at where the folds come here across, her groin area. This is meant to be erotic. It's meant to be sensual, but it's not meant to be too sexy. And then we sort of think about, it's Nike adjusting her sandal. And the reason that it's called adjusting her sandal is, remember, gods walk on holy ground. And so you don't have shoes on holy ground. So we're not sure if she is putting on her sandal or taking it off before she walks into that temple of Athena Nike. So that's what would have been. She would have been on the wall, right? Like you can even see there's a piece of the wall to keep you from falling off into the rest of the town. There would have been a whole sculptural frieze here of of images. And so we see her, and we see that she's definitely leaning, and it's a beautiful piece. She's definitely a figure in motion. There's definitely almost her fabric feels almost transparent. Look at how light and airy and silky this fabric looks versus the fabric on the Ergostines. Okay, look at that. Part of that is due to how high a relief it is. Okay, and look at the fabric here. So this is called wet drapery. It's beautiful. It really shows you the skill that Phidias had, and it really is an important moment in art and in art history, because we really get to see the beginnings of what will come to be really fantastically fabulous art. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to exit out of that. I'm going to come over here. I thought I had this open. I must have accidentally closed this. So there we go. Sorry about that, friends. I'm going to open up Khan Academy's video on polykleitos and the Doryphoros. And I'm going to make this the whole screen. And I'm going to share with you this video on polykleitos and the Doryphoros, and then I'm going to share with you this video on the Parthenon. There are videos on Phidias himself and the Parthenon sculptures. There is a video on the plaque of the Ergostines. There's a video on Nike adjusting her sandal. I would highly recommend, if you have the time, that you watch all of them. They're really excellent. But this one for sure, I'm going to show it to you. So here are Dr. Beth Harris and Dr. Stephen Zucker. And this statue of Doryphoros is at the National Archaeological Museum of Naples. So here we go.
What is perfect? Well, the ancient Greeks thought the human body was perfect. But for them, it was not an individual that was perfect. It was like almost mathematical precision, where the proportions of every part of the body were perfect in relationship to the others.
We're looking at an ancient Roman copy of a Greek bronze original by the great artist Polykleitos, who sought out to demonstrate just that. What would perfect ideal beauty be? Thinking about the mathematical relationship of each part of the human body to the other and in relationship to the whole.
This is a sculpture called the Doryphoros. Doryphoros means a spear bearer, and he would have originally been holding a bronze spear. We call it the Doryphoros. Polykleitos apparently called it cannon, not to mean a piece of armament, but a kind of idealized form that could be studied and replicated. That is, a set of ideas that you followed.
The idea that you could create a perfect human form based on math was really part of a bigger set of ideas for the Greeks. If we think about Pythagoras, for example, Pythagoras discovered that harmony in music was based on the mathematical relationship between the notes.
In fact, Pythagoras tried to understand the origin of all beauty through ratio. And so it follows that the Greeks would be looking for that in one of the forms that they felt were most beautiful, that is the human body. The Greeks would perform their athletics nude, celebrating the body and its physical abilities. But even when they represented figures in noble pursuits like this figure, we have a figure whose clothes have been taken off. This is not because soldiers went into battle nude in ancient Greece, but because this sculpture is not about warfare. It's not a portrait of an individual. This is a sculpture that is about the perfection of human form.
This was found in a palestra in Pompeii, a place where athletes would work out, perhaps as a kind of inspiration for them.
So that's another layer of meaning. The Romans loved Greek art and had it copied in marble very often. And even in a city like Pompeii, we've found thousands of sculptures that are copies of ancient Greek originals. This is based on a sculpture that is at the very beginning of the classical period, before the Parthenon sculptures, but it's after the archaic figures. It's after the standing figure that we know as the Kouros. Here, the Greeks have turned away from the stiff renderings that had been so characteristic of the archaic and have instead begun to examine the human body and understand its physiognomy. This is one of the classic expressions of contrapposto.
The Doryphoros stands on his right foot. His left leg is relaxed. The right leg is weight-bearing, but the left hand would have been weight-bearing with the spear. Similarly, the right arm is relaxed. So there's a sense of counterbalancing and harmony in the composition of the body.
In a Kouros figure, you have both feet firmly planted, although one leg is forward. But nevertheless, if you were to draw a line between the ankles, they would still be horizontal to the floor.
And in a Kouros, the figure is symmetrical.
Here, both of those things have changed. And you see that his left ankle is up. And so you have a tilt of that axis. The axis of the knees are tilted in the opposite way. The hips are parallel to the axes of the knees, but also tipped. And then look what happens as a result of that. In those earlier figures, there was a perfect symmetry and a perfect line that could be drawn down the center of the body. Here, there's a gentle S curve. And you can see, for instance, that his right side is compressed compared to the left side, because the left hip is literally hanging down over that free leg. It's not being supported.
To complete that sense of balance and harmony, Polykleitos turned the head slightly, breaking that symmetry of the archaic Kouros figures. With the invention of contrapposto by the Greeks in the 5th century BCE, we have, for the first time in Western art history, figures who seem fully alive, as though they move in the world. They're like us.
This is a sculpture that is, for all of the complexity of what we just discussed, is simply walking. But the mechanics of the human body walking are incredibly complicated. Here we have a civilization that not only was interested in understanding through careful observation how the body moved, but were interested culturally in capturing that. And so we have a society that puts human potential at the center.
And creates figures who are not transcendent, who don't exist in a separate world, but who exist in our world. They're, in a way, ideal mirrors of ourselves.
Okay, so that's Beth and Stephen, or Dr. Harris and Dr. Drucker. And they do a lot of the Khan Academy videos. They are sort of the arrangers of smart history as far as it goes for art. And they travel to all of these places and make the videos for students who are students of the AP Art History course, so that it's wonderful in case of something like this, where we have to really think about how we're going to teach when we don't have time. And so I'm going to show you the Parthenon one too. You don't have to stick around for it. It is 16 minutes long, and I'm going to.
We're looking
here,
at the
but you don't
Parthenon.
have
This
to
is a huge marble temple to the goddess Athena.
We're on the top of a rocky outcropping in the city of Athens, very high up, overlooking the city, overlooking the Aegean Sea.
Now, Athens was just one of many Greek city-states, and almost every one had an Acropolis, that is, had a fortified hill within its city, because these were warring states.
But in the 5th century, Athens was the most powerful city-state, and that's the period that the Parthenon dates to.
And this precinct became a sacred one rather than a defensive one. This building has had tremendous influence, not only because it becomes the symbol of the birth of democracy, but also because of its extraordinary architectural refinement. The period when this was built in the 5th century is considered the high classical moment, and for so much of Western history, we have measured our later achievements against this perfection.
It's hard not to recognize so many buildings in the West. And there's certainly an association, especially to buildings in Washington, D.C., and that's not a coincidence.
Because this is the birthplace of democracy. It was a limited democracy, but democracy nevertheless.
There was a series of reforms in the 5th century in Athens that allowed more and more people to participate in the government.
We think that the city of Athens had between 300 and 400,000 inhabitants, and only about 50,000 were actually considered citizens. If you were a woman, obviously if you were a slave, you were not participating in this democratic experiment.
This is a very limited idea of democracy.
So this building is dedicated to Athena, and in fact, the city itself is named after her. And of course, there's a myth. Two gods vying for the honor of being the patron of this city.
Those two gods are Poseidon and Athena. Poseidon is the god of the sea, and Athena has many aspects. She's the goddess of wisdom. She is associated with war, a kind of intelligence about creating and making things.
Both of these gods gave the people of the city a gift, and then they had to choose. Poseidon strikes a rock, and from it springs forth the salt water of the sea. This had to do with the gift of naval superiority.
But Athena offered, in contrast, an olive tree, the idea of the land of prosperity, of peace. The Athenians chose Athena's gift. There actually is a site here on the Acropolis where the Athenians believed you could see the mark of the trident from Poseidon where he struck the ground, and also the tree that Athena offered.
Actually, the modern Greeks have replanted an olive tree in that space. Let's talk about the building. It is really what we think of when we think of a Greek temple, but the style is specific. This is a Doric temple.
Although it has Ionic elements, which we'll get to.
So the Doric features are really easy to identify. You have massive columns with shallow, broad flutes, the vertical lines. Those columns go down directly into the floor of the temple, which is called the stylobite. And at the top, the capitals are very simple. There's a little flare that rises up to a simple rectangular block called an abacus. And just above that are triglyphs and metopes.
So it's important to say that this building was covered with sculpture. There was sculpture in the metopes, there was sculpture in the pediments, and in an unprecedented way, a frieze that ran all the way around all four sides of the building, just inside this outer row of columns that we see. Now, this is an Ionic feature. So art historians talk about how this building combines Doric elements with Ionic elements.
And in fact, there were 4 Ionic columns inside the west end of the temple.
When the citizens of Athens walked up the sacred way, perhaps for a religious procession or festival, they encountered the west end and they walked around it, either on the north or south sides to the east end, the entrance. Right above the entrance, in the sculptures of the pediment, they could see the story of Athena and Poseidon vying to be the patron of the city of Athens. On the frieze just inside, they saw themselves, perhaps, at least in one interpretation, involved in the Panathenaic procession, the religious procession in honor of the goddess Athena. And so this was a building that you walked up to, you walked around, and inside was this gigantic sculpture of Athena.
These were all sculptures that we believe were overseen by the great sculptor Phidias. And one of my favorite parts are the metopes, carved with scenes that showed the Greeks battling various enemies, either directly or metaphorically. The Greeks battling the Amazons, the Greeks against the Trojans, the Lapiths against the Centaurs, and the Gigantomachy, the Greek gods against the Titans.
So all of these battles signified the ascendancy of Greece and of the Athenians, of their triumphs, civilization over barbarism, of rational thought over chaos.
And you've just hit on the very meaning of this building. This is not the first temple to Athena on this site. Just a little bit to the right, as we look at the east end, there was an older temple to Athena that was destroyed when the Persians invaded. This was a devastating blow to the Athenians.
One really can't overstate the importance of the Persian War for the Athenian mindset that created the Parthenon. Athens was invaded, and beyond that, the Persians sacked the Acropolis, sacked the sacred site, the temples, destroyed the buildings.
They burned them down. In fact, the Athenians took a vow that they would never remove the ruins of the old temple to Athena.
So they would remember it forever.
But a generation later, they did.
They did. Well, there was a peace that was established with the Persians, and some historians think that that allowed them to renege on that vow. And Pericles, the leader of Athens, embarked on this enormous, very expensive building campaign.
Historians believe that he was able to fund that because the Athenians had become the leaders of what is called the Delian League, an association of Greek city-states that paid a kind of tax to help protect Greece against Persia. But Pericles dipped into that treasury and built this building.
This alliance of Greek city-states, their treasure, their tax money, their tribute was originally located in Delos, hence the name Delian League. But Pericles managed to have that treasure moved here to Athens and actually housed in the Acropolis. And the sculpture of Athena herself, which was made of gold and ivory, Phidias said, if we need money, we can melt down the enormous amount of gold that decorates the sculpture of Athena.
And since that sculpture doesn't exist any longer, we know somebody did that. So we need to imagine this building not pristine and white, but rather brightly colored, and also a building that was used. This was a storehouse. It was the treasury. And so we have to imagine that it was absolutely full of valuable stuff.
In fact, we have records that give us some idea of what was stored here. We think about temples or churches or mosques as places where you go in to worship, but that's not how Greek religion worked. There usually was an altar on the outside where sacrifices were made, and the temple was the house of the god or goddess. But with the Parthenon, art historians and archaeologists have not been able to locate an altar outside. So we've wondered, what was this building? So one answer is it was a treasury.
But it also functions symbolically. It is up on this hill. It commands this extraordinary view from all parts of the city. And so it was a symbol of the city's wealth and power.
And it's a gift to Athena. When you make a gift to your patron goddess, you want visitors to be awed by the image of the goddess that was inside and of her home.
And this isn't any goddess. This is the goddess of wisdom. So the ability of man to understand our world and its rules mathematically and then to express them in a structure like this is absolutely appropriate.
And Ictinos was a supreme mathematician. I mean, we know that the Greeks, even in the archaic period before this, were concerned with ideal proportions.
Pythagoras.
Or the sculptor Polykleitos and his sculpture of the Doryphoros, searching for perfect proportions and harmony and using mathematics as the basis for thinking that through.
And we have that here.
To an unbelievable degree.
What's extraordinary is that its perfection is an illusion based on a series of subtle distortions that actually correct for the imperfections of our sight. That is, the Greeks recognized that human perception was itself flawed and that they needed to adjust for it in order to give the visual impression of perfection. And their mathematics and their building skills were precise enough to be able to pull this off.
Every stone was cut to fit precisely.
Well, when we look at this building, we assume it's rectilinear. It's full of right angles. And in fact, there's hardly a right angle in this building.
There's another interpretation of these tiny deviations, that these deviations give the building a sense of dynamism, the sense of the organic, that otherwise it would seem static and lifeless. The Greeks had used this idea that art historians call entasis before in other buildings, slight adjustments. For example, columns bulge toward the center. So this is not new, but the degree to which it's used here and the subtlety in the way it's used is unprecedented.
Well, for instance, in those Doric columns, you can see that there's a taper and you assume that it's a straight line, but the Greeks wanted ever so slight a sense of the organic, that the weight of the building was being expressed in the bulge, the entasis of the column about a third of the way from the bottom. But in this case, every single column bulges only 11/16 of an inch, the entire length of that column. The way that the Greeks pulled this off is they would bring column drums up to the site. They would carefully carve the base and the top, and then they would carve in between.
So we see this slight deviation in the columns, but we also see it not only vertically, but also horizontally in the building.
Well, that's right. You assume that the stylobite, the floor of the temple, is flat, but it's not. Rainwater would run off it because the edges are lower than the center.
But only very, very slightly lower.
Across the long side of the temple, the center rises only 4 3/8 of an inch. And on the short sides of the temple, on the east and the west side, the center rises only by 2 3/8 inches. But what happens is it corrects. Our eye would naturally see a straight line, seem as if it rises up at the corners a little bit. So it seems to us to be perfectly flat. The columns are all leaning in a little bit.
And you would expect the columns to be equidistant from one another, but in fact, the columns on the edges are slightly closer to one another than the columns in the center of each side.
And architectural historians have hypothesized that the reason for this is because the column at the edge is, in a sense, an orphan. It doesn't have anything past it, and therefore it would seem to be less substantial. So if we could make that column a little bit closer to the one next to it, it might compensate, and you would have an even sense of density across the building.
Placing of the columns closer together on the edges created a problem in the levels above. One of the rules of the Doric order is that there had to be a triglyph right above the center of a column or in between each column.
But they also wanted the triglyphs to be at the very edge. So one triglyph would abut against another triglyph at the corner of the building. And if, in fact, you're placing your columns closer together, you can actually solve for that problem. You can avoid the stretch of the metope in between those triglyphs that would result. But because the columns are placed so close together, they had the opposite problem, which is to say that the metopes at the ends of the building would be too slender. So what Phidias has done in concert with Ictinus and Callicrates, the architects, is to create sculptural metopes that are widest in the center, just like the spaces between the columns. And actually the metopes themselves gradually become thinner as you move to the edges, so that you can't really even perceive the change without measuring.
And the general proportions of the building can be expressed mathematically as x equals y times 2 plus 1. So across the front, we see 8 columns, and along the sides, 17 columns. That ratio also governs the spacing between the columns and its relationship to the diameter of a column. Math is everywhere.
If we look at a plan of the structure, we see the exterior colonnade on all 4 sides. On the east and west end, it's actually a double colonnade. And on the long sides, inside the columns, a solid masonry wall. You can enter rooms on the east and west only. The west has a smaller room with the 4 Ionic columns within it, but the east room was larger and held the monumental sculpture of Athena. It's interesting, the system that was used to create a vault that was high enough to enclose a sculpture that was almost 40 feet high was unique. There was a U shape of interior columns at 2 stories. They were Doric and they surrounded the goddess. The sculpture is now lost, but the building is almost lost as well. Here we come to one of the great tragedies of Western architecture. This building survived into the 17th century and was in pretty good shape for 2,000 years, and it's only in the modern era that it became a ruin.
First, it was, as we know, an ancient Greek temple for Athena. Then it became a Greek Orthodox church, then a Roman Catholic church, and then a mosque. In a war between the Ottomans, who were in control of Greece at this moment in history in the 17th century. And the Venetians attacked the Parthenon. The Ottomans used the Parthenon to hold munitions, gunpowder. Gunpowder exploded from the inside, basically ripping the guts out of the Parthenon.
And then to add insult to injury, in the 18th century, Lord Elgin received permission from the Turkish government to take sculptures that had already fallen off the temple and bring them back to England. And the lion's share of the great sculptures by Phidias are now in London. Greece recently has built a museum just down the hill from the Acropolis, specifically intended to house these sculptures should the British ever release them.
Some have argued that Elgin saved the sculptures that would have been further damaged had he not removed them. But what to do about the future is uncertain.
And at least one theory states that this building was paid for by plundered treasury from the Delian League. So there's a long history of contested ownership.
So as we stand here very high up on the Acropolis, overlooking the Aegean Sea, islands beyond and mountains on this glorious day, I can't help but imagine standing inside the Parthenon between those columns, which we can't do today.
The site is undergoing tremendous restoration. There are cranes, the scaffolding to maintain the ruin and not let it fall into worse disrepair.
But if we could stand there, what would it feel like?
There is this beautiful balance between the theoretical and the physical. The Greeks thought about mathematics as the way that we could understand the divine, and here it is in our world.
There's something about the Parthenon that is both an offering to Athena, the protector of Athens, but also something that's a monument to human beings, to the Athenians, to their brilliance. And by extension, I suppose, in the modern era, human spirit generally.
All right, so that was our lesson on the Doryphoros and on the Acropolis. I hope that you feel like you learned some really cool stuff. I'm hoping that you feel like you know some things that you didn't know before. And we'll see you next time when we do some other cool stuff, the Grave Stele of Hegeso, and some other famous Greek works. Have a good one.